The date was September 19th, 2024, and it was a typical late afternoon in majestic Lake Tahoe. Quiet, serene, with the lingering smell of wet earth from the rain that had washed through the area the day before. We had gotten into the habit of taking daily walks on the lesser-known trails around the outskirts of town. It's our little ritual, a way to disconnect from the chaos and just exist, surrounded by the Sierra pines and the cool, pine-scented air. Today, we were walking along one of the more secluded trails, skirting the edge of a neighborhood, but quickly swallowed by the wild. The trail itself is simple, firm underfoot, its surface an ashy, sandy mix that gives away secrets only the rain can uncover. It was just past 5 p.m., the sun hanging low, casting deep shadows through the trees, and though the day had been clear, the thick canopy overhead dimmed the trail, making everything feel a bit more mysterious. I remember the exact moment we saw it. Well, them. It wasn't gradual, no easing into it. One moment, I was lost in the rhythm of walking. The next, there they were, tracks. I stopped dead in my tracks, pun not intended, and grabbed my husband's arm. He followed my gaze, and we just stood there, silently processing what lay before us. These weren't ordinary prints. They certainly weren't from a bear, and they were far too large to be human. I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints, there were several of them, in a loose, winding pattern, were deep, clear, and impossible to miss. The ground was still soft from the rain, and they stood out sharply against the smooth, sandy soil. I couldn't help but think of those countless documentaries, the ones with grainy footage and shaky cameras, but this was real. These prints were right in front of me, undeniable in their detail. Some were larger than others, easily over 16 inches, while a few smaller ones trailed alongside. We exchanged glances, excitement and disbelief mingling in the air. I pulled out my phone, fumbling with the camera app. "No one's going to believe this," I muttered, more to myself than to him. The idea of circling them seemed like a good way to show scale, so I began dragging my foot around the edges of one of the larger prints, tracing its massive outline. The depth and size were staggering. My husband, with previous military experience, moved off the trail to search for more signs, scanning the underbrush for broken branches, disturbed foliage, anything that might explain the presence of these tracks. And that's when we heard it. It started as a low, almost low-pitched whoop, echoing through the trees, the kind of sound that shouldn't exist out here, not in a place like this. I froze, my body instantly alert. A split second later, the unmistakable sound of a wood knock followed, one sharp and deliberate, like something large had struck a tree. We didn't speak. We barely even breathed. The forest around us had grown eerily still, the birds and insects seeming to retreat in the face of whatever had made those noises. My heart hammered in my chest as my mind raced through every possible explanation, each one less likely than the last. The woods were dense, shadows layering over shadows, and while I squinted in the direction of the sound, I saw nothing. No movement, no sign of anything out of the ordinary beyond the tracks we had just found. But the silence. That silence was unnatural, as though the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. My thoughts flickered to a video I'd watched recently, a YouTuber I follow who investigates strange occurrences in the wilderness. He talked about how Bigfoots, if they exist, if that's even what they should be called, have been pushed closer to towns in recent years. Fires, construction, the steady encroachment of human activity, all of it was driving them out of their usual territories. That thought stuck with me, especially living in California, where wildfires have ravaged so many areas. The Sierras were no stranger to firestorms, and I couldn't help but wonder, if there are creatures like this, where do they go when their habitat burns? We stayed rooted to the spot for a while, listening, waiting for something else. But the forest never stirred again. The whoop and knock were gone as quickly as they had come, leaving behind nothing but our own uncertainty. Eventually, my husband returned from his scouting mission, shaking his head. No more tracks, no other signs. Just that lingering strangeness, that feeling that we had witnessed something we could never fully explain. We continued walking, though with far less conversation than before. The tracks, the sound, the eerie stillness, it all left us unsettled, though I think neither of us wanted to admit it. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like awe, a sense that we had brushed up against something ancient and unknowable. When we finally reached the end of the trail, back where the neighborhood began, and the world felt ordinary again, we paused. I turned around and glanced back at the darkening forest, the hidden creek, the tracks we had left undisturbed except for our circled marks. "I hope they make it," I said quietly, not sure if I was talking to my husband or to myself. "I hope they find a way to stay safe wherever they're going." He nodded but didn't say anything. There wasn't much left to say. Seeing those tracks, it was more than special. It felt like we'd stepped out of our reality for a brief moment into someone else's story and glimpsed something we were never meant to see. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more strange encounters and adventures from the wild, please like and subscribe. It really helps me grow the channel and share even more stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and stay curious out there, especially if you live in areas where there have been sightings. Look for tracks and evidence around you. You never know what you might find.